Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Hopkinton Historical Society's 2019 Cemetery Walk at the Putney Hill Cemetery. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful fall afternoon. My name is Heather Mitchell. I'm the director of the Society, and I am thrilled to see so many people in attendance here today. This production has, I think, the largest cast of any of the previous cemetery walks that we've had, the largest videography group of volunteers that we've had, and it is altogether a wonderful production. And so with that, I will let the story begin.
Putney Hill Cemetery. It's a lovely spot, shady, quiet. It feels far from the bustle of Hopkinton and Kentucky villages. History seems like a quiet murmur in the background, faded and unknowable. We can't even tell you the names of all the people sleeping at our feet in this cemetery, with only a few stones for remembrance. It's hard to imagine that Putney Hill was the epicenter of colonial settlement in Township Number 5, as Hopkinton was known at the beginning. I'm Rose Putney Hanson. My ancestors lived on this ridge that bears our family name since colonial settlers first came to stay in 1736.
And I'm Charles Chase Lord. My family didn't move to Hopkinton until the mid-1800s, but I dug into the history of my boyhood home with gusto. I collected stories from the old folks and wrote the town's history. Life and Times in Hopkinton, New Hampshire, in 3 parts, in 1890.
I've often wondered what possessed my ancestors to leave the comfort of their homes in Massachusetts.
Now, I opined upon that in my town history.
Opined upon.
The location of our present political state occupied a position more or less on the borderlands of civilization. A few miles away from the older settlements were extensive tracts of new land awaiting the advance of the civilized pioneer. The young, strong, and enterprising of any age could not treat such a social opportunity with indifference.
That phrase you used, civilized pioneer, sounds so pompous. I don't think the settlers were any more civilized than the people whose land they were taking. You make it sound as if all our ancestors were brave and noble, not like normal human beings. I think there were more practical reasons for leaving their homes. My ancestors, John and Samuel Putney, and their families were among the first to settle in Putney Hill. Perhaps they'd be willing to share their reasoning.
How goes all at home? When we first arrived, there was some speculation that this town, and in fact the whole line of towns between the Merrimack and Connecticut River, were set up as a sort of a buffer against native attacks on older settlements.
How noble of us to put our lives on the line for those early settlers. But I'll tell you the real reasons we came here, Rose. We felt crowded. Massachusetts wanted to keep this land out of the hands of New Hampshire. They needed to establish facts on the ground, so they offered us cheap land. We became their settlers. But we were not young when we came here from Rumford, which you know today is Concord, in the 1730s. Fact is, I was a grandfather by the time we came here, but I guess I still qualified as being enterprising, though.
So why was this ridge chosen as the center of the new town? Surely a settlement on the plain makes more sense. It's better for farming, for saw and grist mill locations, and easier to travel to. Was it to protect yourself from Indian attacks? I hear that life on the frontier was a very dangerous place.
Did you think we built up here for protection? I think not, sir. We weren't more protected up here than we were down on the plains. There wasn't even that much of a view, at least until we felled all the trees.
Although our town was to have, the ridge was close to the center of town, but we were to have a meeting house. Should not the center of government and religious authority be placed high upon a hill?
Our own shining city on a hill, such as our Puritan ancestors toiled for.
Ah, yes, we were noble after all, but we never actually built that meeting house on the hill. It seems it was all just a metaphor.
We dutifully voted to build the meeting house in 1739, as we were instructed to do as a condition of our grant from Massachusetts.
And we voted, and we voted. Yet, it seems we just could not decide on a location for that meeting house. Mayhap not everyone wanted to climb that shining hill.
To be fair, Sam, we were quite occupied with building our homes and clearing the land, and then war broke out. Most of the residents of our new town took refuge in the garrison houses in Rumford when King George's War broke out in 1744.
Yes, my brother was always much more military in nature than I. He was bestowed the rank of lieutenant in the militia, and he fearlessly came back to the settlement during the war to build a garrison house over yonder. And we fearfully helped him when we could, and then we ran to its safety when needed.
Perhaps an explanation of the war is needed for our modern listeners. King George's War was the third of the 4 wars that you collectively know as the French and Indian Wars. The other 2, King William's War and Queen Anne's War, had ended by 1736, a generation before our ancestors moved to Hopkinton. For an explanation of these latter 2, let's turn to chapter 10 of my town history. From 1744 to 1763, the New England colonies endured the hardship of almost continuous war. King George's War, or the War of Austrian Secession, involved the governments of England and France in a struggle over the throne of Germany. Hence, the boundaries of the English and French colonies in America became borderlands of contention. The 7 Years' War was a contest for these boundaries between the English and the French. Hence, the New England colonies were equally involved in either case. In the event of war, the French in Canada became the allies of the Indians, who repeatedly made prey of the English settlements. In view of these hostile, wild men and the dangers from their attacks, 3 garrisons were early built in number 5, including John Putney's garrison here on Putney Hill. Now, a garrison was a fortified house. The walls were constructed of large sawn logs. The door was reinforced and could be raised and lowered with a pulley.
Charles, you mischaracterize our colonial ancestors' relation with the Abenaki, the indigenous people of northern New England. The English had Indian allies as well. I wonder why people of your time forgot that.
Why, indeed, Rose. Our lives went on here in spite of the occasional attacks from the Abenaki in Canada, those allied with our French enemies. People were born here, and people died here. We began burying the dead in this very piece of land. You can see the crude field stones that mark our heads and feet.
Yes, gone, but not quite forgotten and not quite remembered.
Perhaps a formal gravestone helps us to remember. The oldest such gravestone in this cemetery marks the mortal remains of Lieutenant Aaron Kimball, one of our original settlers. Lieutenant?
My wife Susanna and I lived in Haverhill, Massachusetts, where 5 of our 12 children were born. Our 6th child, Abraham, was born here in Hopkinton in 1742. Abraham became the first white child, born in our new settlement. That was a noteworthy achievement for settlers 300 years ago. When King George's War began, my family lived at Timothy Walker's garrison in Rumford with the Putneys. When they moved and returned up here and built their garrison, I built one down the hill on the road to Rumford, about 2 miles away. I became active in all the early town affairs, and Kimball relatives and descendants remain involved today. My garrison, my son's birth and captivity are written about the most in history books, but there's more to my story than my military achievements and my son's capture. I was a tailor by trade in Massachusetts, a skill that was surely useful no matter where I lived. Sometimes a man needs a finer suit than he can get homemade, even on the frontier. Begging your pardon, friend, but our relations with the Abenaki were about more than fighting. We learned many useful things from them, such as how to live in this wilderness, plants to cultivate and heal, how to travel the rivers and lakes in different types of canoes, how to traverse the snow with snowshoes, even what type of footwear was best suited to the land. Did you know that John Currier, who settled in the Stumpfield district, made and sold moccasins? We were hardly constantly at war if we learned all of these things from the Abenaki. Our relations were uneasy, even during peaceful times, and hostile during times of war. There was fear, suspicion, and misunderstanding born of prejudice, resentment for wrongs real and perceived.
Our histories tend to portray only the negative relation with the Native Americans. We are far less aware of their humanity. But there are clues in your town histories if you read between the lines, Charles. Take the story of Mary Woodwell's capture, for instance.
I was a maid of 16 in April of 1746 when I was captured and taken north to the Abenaki village of St. Francis in Canada. My father David had built a stout garrison here at the westernmost ridge near Kentucky. We were living here, the westernmost outpost of this town, during King George's War. It was a fine garrison, strongly built with thick walls. We were well protected, unless you left the door open, which someone did. And in came the raiders from St. Francis to take us away so the French could get our ransom money. That's the game they played with our lives. The French encouraged their allies to capture us. The Abenaki would take us north to replenish their numbers or would turn us over to the French. The English would bargain with the French and the Abenaki for our return. I fought back, of course. Maybe I was just being headstrong, but maybe I wasn't afraid of Indians. After all, we never felt threatened by the locals. But my captor wasn't a local, and he had had enough of this pesky girl. So he aimed his gun right at me to scare me into behaving. I'll admit, that did scare me. And just as I was beginning to regret my rash behavior, Penno, a local Indian I knew, he stepped between me and the gun barrel. Penno and my father had a cordial relationship during peace times. Penno was patient and he was kind to me during our trip north. And I was sad when I had to part company with a familiar face.
His name was Penno, as according to your town records. That may have been his name, or he may have been Penonkoy, one of the Penonkoyak people. You pronounce it Pennacook. This is the Abenaki land that you settled, colonized, and appropriated, to use your terms. I would say stole, used up, wasted, and abused. Many of you weren't very good about asking permission before you took things, like our land, or not sharing what you had. That is how children behave. Some of you had better manners. David Woodwell, Mary's father, knew how to act like a human being. Sharing is what people need to live in a civilized society. In times of peace, it was not unusual for our hunters to stay at your homes in the winter. Yes, it's true that they may take something when they left in the morning, but they would always leave something in return, like some of the game we caught. If you don't believe me, look at your town records.
Well, yes. I acknowledge that this one native, Penno, was kind, in spite of his being an Indian. But Mary, the lives of our poor captives, forced to live at the hands of cruel and savage people. They made you work in the fields.
My dear sir, you forget that we women worked our fingers to the bone in our homes on the frontier. We had to prepare all the food from scratch. The plucking, chopping, grinding, descaling, skinning. There were no shops out here.
We also did the salting, smoking, drying, pickling, and potting.
We built the fires, we rendered fat for the soap, dipped the candles, and emptied the chamber pots.
We spun, we knit, we weaved, and we sewed our own clothes,
which we then had to wash and iron and mend. We bore and tended the children, the sick, and the dying.
There was so much sickness and death.
Our lives in captivity were no harder than our lives here. In fact, they may have been a bit better. I was ransomed and returned to Hopkinton, but most women captives, they chose to stay with their captors.
Well, most of the men and boys did not. Wonder where the men went. How they had it much better. I'm Abraham Kimball, and I'm son of Aaron, who you met earlier.
Ah, the gallant young lad who fought against his captors and escaped the cruelty of captivity in Canada during the 7 Years' War. As I recounted in my town history, you were captured between Kimball's garrison and Putney's garrison on April 18th, 1756.
Excuse me, sir, but it didn't happen quite the way you wrote it in your books. There was no dog ripping out an Indian's throat, and I don't recall the Flanders boys coming to our rescue in Boscawen. The raiding party certainly did not tarry at a wigwam a mile from here, right? There never was such a story. To say that the Abenaki took a young boy of Abraham's age on their journey to Canada with them may be a sweet sentiment, but it also is not true. They took me, the elder, Samuel Putney. And I was glad to have Grandfather Putney's company. I was just a scared boy. So we must remember, the stories get conflated over time, but the true story is no less exciting, in that the Indians were complex human beings. They're not the one-dimensional savages that they were made out to be. I did dictate my story at the end of my life in a letter to John Osgood Ballard, who kept school here. Let me read a bit of my letter. An Indian came to me as I sat on the ground and attempted to unbuckle my shoe. I, having a pair of brass buckles that cost me $50, was loath to part with them. The Indian, being in an act of stooping to unbuckle, I kicked him backwards, falling, which much pleased the Indians. They gave a whoop. Then the same Indian took in his hand a fine pair of moccasins, and approaching cautiously made such a sufficient sign as to understand, and I permitted me to take off my shoes, throw them away, and put on the moccasins and put the buckles in my pack. Then we marched northerly on the hill west of Boscawen. Then all hell broke loose. The Indian scout ahead of me ran into the Boscawen men. My captor tried to pull me alongside on his wrist and
drew his moccasin, his tomahawk. I was saved when a large dog knocked over the Indian and I ran to Grandfather Putney. We made our escape. I often dwell on that scene in later years. Such kindness one moment, and the other moment, terror. War is a paradox and irony.
As many of us experienced during the tumultuous wars between England and France, and later between our colonies and Mother England. But life in our new settlement was about more than war. We had yet to build our meeting house, but we did hire our first full-time minister in 1757.
Being good Congregationalists, we formed a committee to choose our man and organize his ordination. My brother Sam and I served on the committee, as did Aaron Kimball. Two other early settlers, Matt Stanley and Stephen Hoyt, served as well.
Reverend Brother John, Brother Samuel. And they chose me, the Reverend James Scales, to be their first settled minister. I was educated at Harvard and then taught school in Boxford, Massachusetts, until, with my wife Susanna, I moved to Rumford, becoming that town's first schoolmaster. It was my very good fortune in Rumford to be able to study theology with the Reverend Timothy Walker and to study medicine with Dr. Ezra Carter. I then moved to Canterbury, and it took all my skills to earn a living in that village. I was the town's first minister, town clerk, justice of the peace, and doctor. You know, back then, church and state were very much intertwined, and local citizens were levied a tax to pay my ministerial salary. However, the town only allowed for a part-time minister, hence my other occupations. It was before the outbreak of King George's War that I was called upon to build a truck house, or what some would call a trading post, for the purpose of trading with the Pennacook Indians. I can't recall if the trading post was built before the war or after. You know, history's full of those little mysteries. Anyway, I was well prepared to trade with the Native Americans in peacetime, but I was also well prepared to fight them when war came. I served as a scout with the rank as sergeant in the local militia. In fact, our militia was called out in pursuit of the captors in Mary Woodwell.
Reverend Scales.
Brother Matt.
I too moved to Rumford from Massachusetts. It was right around the time that the war broke out. I was quickly assigned to a scouting expedition to Westmoreland, and I ended up being a captain in the militia. My name is Matthew Stanley. When I returned back to Rumford, I was assigned to the garrison house of Lieutenant John Walker. It was there that I met Aaron Kimball and the Putnam brothers. Well, Reverend Scales, as you know, I was on the ordination committee that selected you. The committee was deeply appreciative of the fact that you were a learned man, as well as being very handy with a musket. Practicality and spirituality all in one, and we also knew that you had other skills. It was an excellent bargain for us.
Thank you, Brother Matthew. I greatly appreciated that the town of Hopkinton voted to accept me as their minister, and they also allowed for a full-time salary. Shortly thereafter, I bought the lots that the town had set aside for its minister, and I built the parsonage. In fact, it's just across the way. You can still see the cellar hole. Well, with my wife and our two surviving children, we moved in. Since the town didn't have a meeting house, we held church services either at the parsonage or across the way at the garrison. The 7-year war, it raged all around us. And I lost a member of our parish, Stephen Hoyt.
My name is Stephen Hoyt, proprietor of Township Number 5, now Hopkinton, New Hampshire. My father, Abner Hoyt, was proprietor of Pennycook, then called Rumford, now Concord, New Hampshire. We came up from Massachusetts in thereabouts 1730. My wife Abigail's family, the Eastmans, were granted land in Pennycook. My father was granted land in Pennycook. I was granted land here. We claimed it. We are the lawful owners. The Indians hadn't quite properly tamed this land. The men were indolent. They spent all their time hunting when they made the women do the real work of raising crops. The land was passed to its rightful heirs, those most able to exploit its abundance. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. Genesis 1:28. The Indians were still skulking around the outskirts of the settlements. Oh, you could trade with them, get some useful items like baskets and brooms and moccasins and snowshoes, but you couldn't trust them. They could be vengeful when raised from their indolence. I was always prepared for a fight. I learned the Indians' ways of warfare, and I used it against them. But ultimately, in the end, I failed.
My brave Stephen, during the 7 Years' War, volunteered for the scouting campaigns around Rumford. He joined the famous Rogers Rangers and accompanied them on their fateful trip to the Indian village of St. Francis in Canada. I like to imagine the letters he would have written home if such a thing had been possible.
My diary. September 23rd, 1759. My dearest wife, the Rangers are commanded to destroy the village of St. Francis to stop the vexatious raids on our settlements. We took to the waters of Lake Champlain in whale boats, rowing all night to escape the detection of the French. The weaker of our forces turned back to Crown Point, sick or injured. The strong press on, undeterred by cold, wet, unable to light fires, lest give away our position. We left the boats in Missisquoi Bay with 2 of our Indian scouts and took to foot through the spruce bogs. Our pace will be slow, but we will march resolutely onward. October 2nd, 1759. Dearest wife, our march has left us dirty, exhausted, and hungry. I find myself at times longing for the warmth of the hearth and my loving embrace of my wife. We were temporarily disheartened when the Indian scouts we left with our boats and supplies reported that the French had discovered them. Rogers was undeterred. His steadfastness raised our flagging spirits. We will return overland after the job is done, though the tough be going tough. We no doubt will find food for the taking of St. Francis. October 4th, 1759. We surprised the inhabitants before dawn this morning. We were astonished at the sturdiness of their houses. Many had windows, proper cellars, lofts, finer than our own frontier dwellings. I was humbled by the sight of a large church in the center of this Indian town, knowing that we had yet built our own house of worship. The fight was over in a matter of hours. We set their houses, wigwams, and that fancy Baptist church to the torch.
The details differ depending on who's telling the story. Rogers claimed that he killed 300 warriors. The French, who arrived shortly after, said that only 30 were killed. Abenaki families still pass these stories on till today. Most agree that a man from another tribe came and warned of the raid the night before. The women and children were hiding in a ravine near the village. All accounts say that the St. Francis Abenaki chased and harassed those rangers all the way back to Fort Number 4.
Somewhere in the New Hampshire territory, date unknown. Abigail, my strength fails me. There's no food in this wilderness. We are forced to eat bark, leaves, or any vile crawling creature we can lay our hands on. Men have boiled leather and powder horns for subsistence. In desperation, some have turned to cannibalism. Major Rogers split our force into small groups to better escape our tormentors. My small band headed into the White Mountains to our doom. I must confess before God and you, my darling wife, that hubris had led to my impending demise, aided by cold, exhaustion, and hunger. I hope without hope that my letters will find you. Forgive me, kiss the children, pray that God sees fit to reunite us one day in heaven.
my strong, resolute, handsome warrior husband. His mortal remains were found that spring on an island in Lake Winnipesaukee. A snuff box bearing his name was found with them. With Stephen's passing, I became a widow, a position which granted me the same rights as any other landowner. A woman would lose those rights to her husband if she remarried. So I never remarried, and I exercised my rights. Look closely at the early town records. The originals, not the ones copied into the town history. You will see that on February 3rd, 1766, I dissented when they voted to build the meeting house on the Hopkinton Plains instead of here on the hill. Take note, young women, hold fast to your rights. We, your foremothers, had the right to vote before the War for Independence. The men who built this new country took that right away from us. We had to fight for well over 100 years to get it back.
That's right, folks. We finally built the new meeting house, but we built it off in the village. The war with the French ended in 1763, and I drew up the town's papers of incorporation in 1765. That was the year that we built the house for worship and for meetings. And I preached from the pulpit of the new church for a short while, but I had a falling out with some of the parishioners. In hindsight, that was a sign of things to come, those disagreements. For over the years, other parishioners fell out with the Congregational Church, and they left to join other religious sects. Eventually, I was dismissed as the town minister. But I used my training as a barrister to make a living, and I stayed in Hopkinton until I died in July of 1776, and America's war for independence was well underway.
Brother James.
Brother John.
Death, disease, and injury were a common presence in the 18th century, but so were life, health, and recovery. My name is Dr. John Clement Jr., the town's first doctor. When did I come to Hopkins? I'm not sure exactly, but it was sometime before 1770. After that, my children were born, and I'm almost sure they were all born here. Back in my day, folks used home remedies and Abenaki cures for most illnesses. Midwives delivered most of the babies. But in those hard cases, folks needed an educated surgeon, like me. If something needed cut open, drilled, or drained, I had the instruments. I mended broken bones, and if I couldn't fix them, I amputated. And I always kept a good supply of leeches on hand, because a little bloodletting now and then was good for body and soul. I traveled all over these parts. Folks from 14 towns called for my help. And when I returned home, my wife, Molly, was very welcoming. We had 9 children.
My wife Sarah and I were not blessed with quite such an abundance of children, but we enjoyed each other nonetheless. I'm Abraham Brown, and I cultivated fruit on Putney Hill.
Apples, pears, peaches, plums, cherries, grapes, and a host of berries. My husband delighted in experimenting with new varieties, watching each small seed and bud grow into sweet, nourishing fruit. I believe his soul was nourished in the tending, for it was a constant reminder of God's grace. What was that saying you often recited?
Ah, the seed. The grace of God is small in his first appearance, even as the morning light. But if it's obeyed and tended to, it increases in brightness, till it shines in the soul like the sun in the firmament and the new day height.
Ah, a lovely quote from friend Elizabeth Bathurst.
I was also a friend of truth. My neighbors called the Friends Quakers because they said we quaked with religious zeal.
They were not being kind with that nickname, but it was a small enough indignity to suffer on behalf of true faith.
I did not share the congregational religious beliefs of our neighbors. I cared not for hymns or creeds, ministers or meeting houses, for I believed that the small voice of God was in each of us. And because it was in each of us, I couldn't condone killing, couldn't countenance war. I declined to sign the declaration drawn up by the so-called Committee of Safety, so to serve during the war between England and the American colonies in 1776.
It was not a popular stance.
I lived a bit beyond the war, tending my fruit, raising my family. I died in 1812. My Sarah died in 1819. Perhaps you will find us in the cemetery, but our graves would be unmarked. The Friends did not believe in erecting ornate stones to separate us one from another, for in death we are all equal.
My sons and I declared on behalf of the colonies. My sons, Jonathan, Benjamin, and Joseph, all took up arms against the British. I was too old to fight, but there was another goal for me to fulfill. Shortly after the Battle of Bunker Hill, a courier arrived seeking to have patriots march to Boston and assist in the war against Britain. Another rider was needed to spread that message to Sutton and Warner. I volunteered to take on that task, but I vowed that I would have the fastest horse in town to accomplish my mission. That horse was owned by the Quaker, Abraham Brown. I immediately went to his house and I said, Abraham, I must have your horse. Give it to me now. Abraham looked at me and said, Brother Matthew, thouest know that I am a man of peace. I cannot give you the horse. Not to be resisted, I said again to Abraham, please give me the horse. Abraham replied, there is nothing that can compel me to give you that horse to assist in the war effort. I raised my fist to the heavens and I said, let this be the power. Abraham looked at me and said, I shall not give you that mare that you will find in yonder field, nor will I give you the bridle or saddle that you'll find in the mill house. I returned the horse, no worse for wear. Quaker's Brown reputation, however, was worse for the wear, or there were members in the community who questioned and laughed about the extent of his moral conviction. I exercised no judgment on that, for I wondered whether or not a man of peace had decided that peace with his neighbors was more valuable than all else.
Good day to you. I am Thomas Burnham, the fourth. My great-grandfather moved to Ipswich Bay Colony, Massachusetts in 1635. The Burnhams were soldiers and impressed sailors throughout the French and Indian Wars. Ipswich responded to the alarm of April 19th, 1775. You know it now as the battles of Lexington and Concord. The British had hightailed it back to Boston before we arrived in Medford. We decided to stay and guard the town. It wasn't until later, when we arrived back in Ipswich, we found it deserted. People had panicked, fleeing north, thus panicking other seacoast towns. A boy on horseback was sent to undeceive those that had panicked. It became known as the Great Ipswich Fright. The Burnhams were also at Bunker Hill. My uncle was injured, and my cousin carried an injured man off the battlefield. But I'll let friend Samuel Putney tell it. His son was there.
My son was at Bunker Hill. He fought with General Stark's 1st New Hampshire Regiment, along with the other Hopkinton men. He told of the battle in this letter. The arrogant British expected that we would turn tail when they advanced on our position. We were standing behind a rail fence stuffed with straw. General Stark planted a stick not 80 yards in front of us. He said he'd knock us down himself. if we fired before the redcoats reached that stick. The British began marching up the hill like some mindless automaton. You could feel the nervous energy along our line, like 100 rabbits ready to bolt, but we held. The British reached Stark's mark, and we fired. The front rows fell dead. But the automaton kept marching. We kept firing. If the British won that battle, it was certainly a costly victory.
Washington arrived to find the British under siege, yet heavily supplied by British merchant ships. On November the 1st, 1775, the Provincial Congress decreed an act for encouraging the fixing out of armed vessels to defend the seacoast of America, and for erecting a court to try to condemn all vessels that shall be found infesting the same. Broadsides quickly appeared. An invitation to all brave seamen and marines who have an inclination to serve their country and make their fortunes. Vessels fitted with guns and cannons for attack, defense, and pursuit. And fleet enough for flight, if necessary. Privateers, a seaborne militia, were a key to winning the War of Independence. With Boston Harbor closed, sailors were left whittling on the docks. They were more than willing to volunteer their time. Serve their country? Yeah. But earn their fortunes? Yes, yes, yes! Why, I joined under Captain John Leach, sailing on the Dolphin. It was one of the first ships to answer the call. Our task was to interrupt British supply lines. Interrupt we did. A privateer crew needed sailors and Marines. Marines manned the guns and took to the mast, laying down suppressing musket fire while the prize was boarded. Captured military supplies went to the army, while the ship, with the rest of its cargo, were sold, and profits were divided amongst the crew. Why, a mere sailor could do quite well under a successful captain. Later on, George Washington called for the creation of a navy. In fact, the Dolphin was one of the first ships to join, but it quickly reverted back to privateer. More profit. And privateer life had a more relaxed code of conduct. Over 1,000 privateers plied to the waters of the Atlantic, interrupting British supplies. Each prize boosted the morale and sentiment of the Americans, while the Continental Army was struggling. Yes, the seaborne militia was a force in the war effort. It was an adventure, but I later answered my cousin, Major John Burnham's call for recruits. Unlike many of the patriots in Boston, I joined the Continental Army. I was with George Washington from New York to Valley Forge to Yorktown.
I was with Stark at Bunker Hill and at the Battle of Bennington. Stark strengthened his reputation as a hero that day. I gained reputation as a tough old bird when I was shot in the knee and managed to make myself come home to Hopkinton to recuperate for 6 months, surrounded by my 8 children.
According to the records I was able to uncover, 138 men from Hopkinton did their patriotic duty in the War for Independence. Many of the names of Putney Hill families were on that list.
Wasn't it ironic that while these fine men went to fight for freedom, one resident, Seco, fought while still enslaved? Does that surprise you? Many have forgotten that enslaved people toiled in Hopkinton.
There were only 2 that I heard of.
Does that low number somehow excuse the institution? I wonder, Mr. Lord, why his military service is not acknowledged in your history? Why isn't his family's history written in your book? Well, I wrote it for you. He was known as Seco, but his name is more correctly pronounced Sekou, the learned and wise one. His name is key to his origin. It tells you he was born in Africa, in an area known as Guinea. He could very well have been Muslim. Many in his homeland were. He survived the Middle Passage, shackled in the fetid hold of a boat, to be auctioned off like an animal at one of your port cities. John Courier of Kingston enslaved him. Sekou would have been in his teens. Courier willed Sekou to his wife, along with other household goods. He was brought to this town in 1766 by Joseph Bernard, a friend of the Courier family. Loaned, no doubt, like any workhorse, mere chattel. Torn away from his homeland, ripped away from his community of fellow enslaved persons in Rockingham County, suffering untold indignities and treated like a child, That was his fate. He listened to you talk of freedom and equality and then marveled at how little you truly understood the concepts. He knew himself to be your equal and was determined to free himself. So Sekou joined your militia to fight for his freedom. Black men were not welcome in the Continental Army until Washington needed to boost his numbers. You needed black men in order to win your war. You've always used non-citizens to defend your country's ideals.
Well, yes, I admit that. But at least he was allowed to serve and then rewarded with his freedom.
Sekou's company was formed back in Rockingham County, where there were other black soldiers. I wonder, was he not welcome to fight alongside Hopkinton's sons?
Well, his life here couldn't have been all that bad. I hear he begged to live with Bernard after the war.
Your histories are full of stories that make black people sound like dependent children. Perhaps you would rather think that about us than admit that after our labor made you wealthy, you casted us aside and forced to work jobs that could barely sustain us. I cannot tell you where Sekou died or where he was buried. I can tell you that he was never welcomed here.
It's hard to take an unflinching look at our histories and admit we have wronged others. It's even harder to see how we perpetuate those wrongs without thinking.
I am Ruth Burnham, wife of Thomas. I'm sure you heard all about his exploits in the War for Independence. After that tumult was over, we moved to this hill, right over there, on the road to Hopkinton Village. Hopkinton wasn't the frontier anymore, but there was still plenty of hard work to be done. I brought a bit of loveliness with me to brighten the dreary days. Lilacs, the first in town. It's been said that all the lilacs here are descended from those tender blooms that I brought with me from Massachusetts. I was proud of my children, of course I was. Thomas, the town treasurer and first postmaster of Kentucky, John, with his successful lumber business, Lucy, who made a wonderful wife, and Abraham, a captain in the militia. He was the only one who didn't go away and leave me. It seems that the burgeoning industrial center of Kentucky was too much of a lure for Thomas and John, and Lucy had to follow her husband to Salisbury, of course. Abraham was content to stay on the homestead with me and my lilacs. Our beloved Putney Hill was shrinking in importance, but my stand of lilacs continued to grow.
My name is Rebecca Hazelton Eaton. My husband, Ichabod, and I began our married life in Haverhill, Massachusetts in 1799. I gave birth to many children, 11 in all. Goodness, I was with child more often than not in over 20 years. My youngest was born here on Putney Hill. In many ways, my life had been easier than it had been for my foremothers. I could obtain all manner of household goods in the village stores, and Ichabod had ample employment as a mason in this growing town. Motherhood brought the most profound moments of joy to my life, but bowed my heart with grief more often than I cared to remember. The threat of deadly childhood disease filled my heart with dread every time I wiped a runny nose or soothed a fevered brow. Now, a broken bone could be mended, but many ailments were beyond the ministrations of a parent or even a doctor. And in that regard, my life was no easier than it had been to generations and generations of women before me. 3 of my young ones were taken from me in June of 1823 during that throat distemper epidemic. I held them, I rocked them, I sang to them, I prayed over them.
their little throats closed and they sobbed with pain. I was trying to hold back my own sobs as they slowly suffocated. But I had to stay strong. I was still the mother of 8 children and the wife to a grieving father. Over 70 of Hopkinton's innocent babies died during those dreadful 3 years. Elizabeth, Charlie, and Rebecca. Their little bodies lie buried over next to the entrance of this burying ground. But their graves only marked by my tears. But God is merciful, and he spared my youngest, my month-old baby Julia. And she grew up into a strong young woman, so full of life.
Full of life and full of modern ideas. I wasn't going to hang around and let some boy pick me as his wife. I was 16 years old, and it was almost 1840, for heaven's sakes. Ma was afraid to let me out of her sight, but I said, Ma, I'm no loafer. I'm going to Lowell to work in the mills. And off I went on the fastest stagecoach out of Hopkinton. I became an operative. That meant I operated the looms that made the cloth. The factories were sure a lot louder than the farm, but the boarding house full of mill girls was a lot of fun. I don't know why, but the thought of a bunch of us women and girls working outside our homes just horrified some folks. One scallywag wrote that we mill girls would only work a few years before our health and our morals were worn out. We'd go home to die or become spinsters due to our ruined reputations. Well, I never. I was a strong young woman with a good moral upbringing. And that didn't change just because Ma wasn't around to watch me all day. I went to church every Sunday. I even attended lectures at the Lowell Institute. Couldn't do that in Hopkinton. Now, life at the mills wasn't perfect. The hours were pretty long and the wages could have been better. So we organized to get a 10-hour workday and higher wages. It didn't matter to us that women didn't have the right to vote. We started a union anyway. We didn't get what we wanted, but I think we made them sit up and take notice. When I was 22, I married Isaac Hall, who was a machinist at the mill. He fixed the looms that I operated. His health failed him, the brown lung, so I took him home to Putney Hill. He was healthy enough to give me 2 children before he passed on. Sadly, they went on to a better place when they were still quite young. The whole family's buried here. You'll see my name on the gravestone too, but I'm not there. No, I had a lot of living to do. I married again, this time to Augustus Bernard. He was a vigorous man, 10 years my junior. He curried leather for a living. That meant he added color to the tanned hides and otherwise made them look pretty. Sadly, my younger husband went off to fight with the Union during the rebellion. He survived the fighting, but he died 3 months after coming home due to the dysentery he caught in Louisiana. I still had decades of living to do. My house was always filled with friends from far and near, and I wasn't laid to rest beside Augustus until I'd lived a good long life, well into the new century.
Industrialization wasn't the only big change that happened after the Revolution.
There was a great religious awakening.
Historians recognize it as the Second Great Awakening. It arose in reaction to industrialization.
A host of new denominations sprung up in Hopkinton and won over converts.
The Second Great Awakening inspired the moral crusades of the 1800s. Temperance, abolition, prison reform, care for the mentally handicapped and the physically disabled. Even women's right to vote. Citizens of Putney Hill became members of these new churches, partaking in and benefiting from the moral reform movement.
My name is Ransom Parker. I was born in Mount Vernon, New Hampshire. I lived in Hopkinton when I was in my teens and 20s. That would have been in the 1820s and 30s. It was common for young men and women to live with and work for other families, although it was very unusual for a black man to attend an academy. Yet, there I was, studying at the Wesleyan Methodist Academy in Massachusetts a short time later. The Methodists practiced what they preached. They accepted all God's children at their school. After I graduated from the academy, I was employed as a teacher of black children in Providence, Rhode Island. Later in life, I became a nurse. I am proud to say that I took a leading role in the fight to reinstate black men's voting, which we did in 1842, long before most other states. I fought against segregated schools and slavery. I fought for temperance. I was ordained an elder in African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was the center of black social activism in the city. I lived as worthy a life as any of the white inhabitants of this town. Although, the only place that you'll find my name remembered is in the 1820 census. Squeezed into the margin, sideways, barely legible, segregated.
The mentally ill were marginalized as well. There were no hospitals for their treatment. If they committed a crime, they went to jail. Under the influence of reform groups, the state hospital was opened in 1842. Charles, you presented a sympathetic portrait of one of our mentally ill residents of that time.
You refer, of course, to Benjamin Rowell. The Rowell family lived across the road in what had been the old Scales parsonage. When they lived here, the whole south side of this ridge was known as Rowell's Hill. Benjamin was an extremely intelligent young man, but he was of a nervous temperament. As he aged, it became clear that he was mentally ill, what we called a lunatic. Most of the time, he was perfectly harmless, but then, he would descend into a murderous frenzy.
That's right, I'm a murderer. I shot young Calvin Holmes dead. Witness says I shot him because he wouldn't go hunting with me, but I didn't shoot him out of spite or anger. I just saw him standing there by his wagon eating bread and cheese, and I thought to myself, he looks so silly I think I'll shoot him. So I did. Well, put me in the county jail here in Hopkinton, and when I was calm, they'd let me walk around outside. Now, I'd play a little trick on Jailer Leach. I'd pretend like I was escaping, and half the town would go running down the road looking for me, and I'd pop up behind him, and I'd say, here he is, why don't you catch him? Well, I was good most of the time. The local boys would come by, and I'd teach them how to make these little hemlock bows and these shingle arrows. That was all fun and games, but then sometimes this feeling would swell up inside of me, and my body would feel like a powder keg with a short fuse, and the swelling would go to my brain, and the thoughts would start coming faster and faster until I knew what I'd have to do to relieve the pressure. I'd have to kill something, or someone. I shot whole flocks of birds out of my jail cell window.
I shot chickens for Sheriff Leach. I'd shoot anything for anybody needed it to be shot. I was a useful member of society. After about 10 years, they decided that I wasn't a common criminal, but insane. And they just built this new insane asylum up to Concord. So they put me in it, and for the 20 years I was in that asylum, people from this town visited me regular. I even saved 2 boys from drowning. I figured I only killed one. I saved 2. They should call it even and let me go. But they didn't see it that way. When I finally died in 1864, they loaded my body on a wagon and dropped it right there. And my family come out and buried me up here in the northeast corner. Am I resting in peace? I don't know, but that I may be. There's your red oak. There's your red pine. There's your pocket knife. I don't know, I guess I must have killed them.
Poor Ben. Now, the Rowells were a good family, sturdy farmers. I should know, my mom was a Rowell. Me, I was born a Putney, Ira A. Putney, descendant of Samuel and great-granddaddy to Rose here. Before I settled into farming here on the hill, I was a teamster, and I traveled all manners of goods to the merchants here in town. I traveled night or day as far as Boston or Vermont. Now, please don't tell my temperance-minded neighbors, but a fair amount of my merchandise was liquor destined for the inns and taverns right here in town. Now, after I settled into farming, I really prospered. Enough so that I had time to get into politics. Mid-century, I was town selectman, then tax collector, moderator, and I did a tour as a representative in the State House. Now, I was also pretty well known as an auctioneer. After the rebellion, we developed a kind of chant that was fast and made the whole thing seem urgent. I could mesmerize people with my chant. I could get them to bid higher and higher, enjoying themselves the whole time. Now look at this mule. Ain't she pretty? Who give me $8? Who give me $8? Give me $8. $8. Who give me $9? Give me $9. Give me $9. Who give me $10? $10. $10. Pretty mule. $10. $10. $10. $10. Who give me $11? $11. $11. Who give me $10.50? $10.50. So, you know, there are a lot of stories I could tell about the 1800s, but Rose, which ones were your favorites?
The ones not written in the history books. I love the stories about the Abenaki who lived in town. I included them in the book I wrote on the subject.
Those were fun stories. You know, we mingled all the time with the Indians in town. We were invited to their powwows and barbecues. The young folks, we had friendly competitions, road races, shooting competitions. I won some of those road races myself.
I understand that toward the end of your life, there was a man in town who shared his meals of stewed pig's feet with his Abenaki friends.
Yeah, that's right. Yep, those meals were famous. Enough so once when he was traveling in New York State on a hunting trip, he sat down to share a meal with some Indians there. One of those, he let on to them that he was from Kentucky. Well, one of those Indians from New York jumps up and says, "Mr. Pig's Feet!" But you know, Rose, there were Abenaki women here in town too. In fact, some of them made some of those fine baskets we used up to the farm.
We cooked all of the food for the feast, too, and fed everyone that came. We even shared some of our medicines. Now, you have all been told that the Abenaki people left this land in the 1700s. That's not so. We were always here in Indakina. Indakina is what the Abenaki people call our land. And you have the proof of that in your museums, in your historical societies. Our stories survived, our baskets survived. What did not survive was our names. Perhaps our friendship never extended far enough for you to ever learn our names. Perhaps it was just easier to erase us from history if we had no names. Now, your school teachers tell our children that we do not exist. But we have always been here. We are still here. Our children know the truth. Perhaps it's time your children knew the truth as well.
As historians, we have a responsibility to tell everyone's story and to strive to recognize and overcome the biases of our time. We have one more story to tell. These two lives were intertwined, but we know so little about one of them.
My name is Teresa Hutchins. I'm not from Putney Hill originally, but when I saw how beautiful it was, I had to move here. This is where my husband Stilson Hutchins, the newspaper man, had his family origins. Yes, that Stilson Hutchins, the editor of the Washington Post. His mother was Clara Eaton Hutchins, one of Rebecca Eaton's daughters, Julia's older sister. I got along well with my in-laws, much better than I got along with my husband. Stilson had a roving eye, and we eventually divorced. Extreme cruelty. I had enough of marriage, but Stilson gave it a couple more tries. He had such a reputation as a philanderer. They even alluded to it in the papers. He was going on about how dreadful it was that Mormon men had all those wives. One pithy woman interjected, "The only difference, Mr. Hutchins, between you and the Mormon men is that they drive their team all abreast, while you drive them in tandem." I can just imagine the look on his face. After the divorce in 1882, I settled into a comfortable routine. I wintered in New York City with my daughter Clara and summered at my home on Putney Hill. It was a simple life. Just the servants and me in the old Eaton homestead. Mildred, my granddaughter, joined us after her mother died, and Putney Hill eventually became my home year-round. It was then I became a gentlewoman farmer. Local hired men did the heavy work, while I concentrated on planting flowers and flowering shrubs to beautify my land. That was an important part of my community service as a member of the Putney Hill Improvement Association. I passed on in 1915 and was buried in this cemetery on my beloved Putney Hill. My ex-husband's family lived on in Hopkinton through my granddaughter and her descendants, the Penns and the Hardys. We're all buried here. Stilson is not.
My name is Sarah Wilson, Mrs. Hutchinson's servant. The last 20 years of her life, I was born in Virginia, the year of the Emancipation Proclamation. I moved north to look for work in the year of the Reconstruction. Slavery was dead, but Jim Crow was in full force. You wonder what my life was like when I moved to Hopkinton? Did I mind being uprooted from New York to come to a small town where there weren't many people of my race to keep me company? The census taker said that I was married. Well, where was my husband? There were no men in our household in Putney. Did I have to leave him in the city while we summered here? Did we have any children? Well, who raised them? What became of me when Mrs. Hutchinson died? Where am I buried? So little is known of the servants, especially the ones of color. Do you wonder what your ancestors thought of me, this black person, here in this place? And what did they think about me? Is that what they were doing when they did blackface in the parades? Did they think about me at all?
How may I answer your questions? Madam, a historian must rely on extant evidence. Letters, diaries, newspapers, the census. Records of some type. I will allow that our understanding of history evolves over time as new information presents itself. Certainly, we have witnessed such an evolution here today. Historians can be the victims of their own time, interpreting the evidence that can be ascertained through the lens of the belief of their day. One thing remains clear, the answers to many historical questions remain elusive.
Indeed, there are many unanswered questions about residents of Putney Hill, no matter their skin color. My ancestors envisioned this hill as the center of a vibrant new community. It was not to be. 2 new centers grew in the town, while this ridge became a quiet outpost of farms and summer homes. Over time, history was forgotten. We do not know the names of many who were buried in this cemetery. We lost the location of those we knew were here. But that's how history goes. The farther things fade into the past, the harder they are to recover. Sometimes, though, something wonderful happens. We recover stories we thought we had lost. We pay attention to people we had ignored. We look at the familiar in a new way. And doesn't history come to life when we do? Ransom Parker, Ozzy's mom, come join us.
Thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and please join with me to recognize some amazing people. We would like to say a huge thank you to all of our friends and researchers who dug in to find the facts, clean the cemetery, and give us the stories. We would like to say thank you to our costume mistresses, Nadine Ferrero and Beth Spalding. They helped us to be able to reflect the residents of our cemetery. Thank you to this outstanding cast who brought to life the voices of Putney Hill. We would like to say thank you to videographer Bob Laprie, photographer Bill Hill, together with Benny Madden, for documenting these stories. We would like to give a big thank you to our fabulous producer, Heather Mitchell, the Executive Director of the Hopkinton Historical Society.
been doing so much work behind the scenes. It's been absolutely incredible. We would like to extend our warmest thank yous to our leader and director, Beth Spalding, who has kept us on point. And another warm thank you to our esteemed writer, Dr. Lynn Clark, who has helped us understand our town. Right, no, this ribbon and that. Thank you. Thank you again for joining us.